Shalawan Shabata says here the Black Americans suing to reclaim their Native American identity. Remember, we've been reading Making Indians White and all this suits that you know American natives, so-called slaves, did so they can gain their freedom to prove they were Indian. And so here we see a modern case still going, like we just left off on the other video. It's still happening today. All right, so let's get into this article. It says here, and we gotta dodge the hijack all the time, as it says here, their ancestors were black slaves owned by Native Americans. So we already know that's completely false. Most, if not all, because we know, right? Just like Webster's dictionary tells us that the original Americans, right, were the copper-colored tribes of America. And we're going to be talking about creeks, right? So we just got this in the last video, right? This is what a creek looks like. This is a real Creek warrior, Tustenugi Imafla. All right, so you can see, all right, this is what a Creek looks like. They weren't slaves, all right? The Creeks were so-called Negro, and they were coming from Mexico, a nation of Aboriginal Negroes, as we've seen in the last video parts, all right, and all the books we've read. All right, so let's get on with the article. It says here, Johnny Mae Austin and her grandson Demario Solomon Simons can tell you everything about their ancestry. They can go back as far as 1810, the year Solomon Simons' great-great-great-great-grandfather, Cow Tom, was born. With undeniable pride, they recount the man's feats of bravery during the Civil War and his leadership with Oklahoma's Creek population. In fact, they are so determined to let the world know exactly who Cow Tom was that they're suing the Creek Nation to make sure his descendants aren't forgotten. Solomon Simons and his grandmother are black, but they argue they're also Creek, and they're fighting to reclaim their identity. They're fighting to reclaim their identity, and that's what all of you are basically doing right now as well. In 1979, a new tribal constitution made it more difficult to prove Creek ancestry. Black Creeks, in particular, found it almost impossible to claim the identity of their ancestors, and as a result, thousands lost their Creek citizenship. In August 2018, Solomon Simons, the lead attorney representing 6 named plaintiffs, including his grandmother, filed a lawsuit against the Muskogee Creek Nation and the Interior Department to fully restore the citizenship of Black Creeks. Dodge the hijack with black. As a result, a minority group is suing another minority group for inclusion in the indigenous minority group. And to settle this peculiar case, one has to go back nearly 200 years. All right, so we see here the beautiful great mother, Johnny Mae Austin, says whose grandfather was a Creek to the bone, is a plaintiff in the Creek freedmen suit. A Creek to the bone, just like Tustenugi Imafla. A Creek to the bone was a full-blooded Creek. All right, full-blooded Creek. No Africans, there's no slave, no nothing like that. Dodge the hijack. All right, so it says Austin, 86, was born in Haskell, Oklahoma. Her grandfather, Jake Simons, was Creek to the bone, she says. Simons spoke fluent Creek, and Austin chuckles at the memory of him using Creek curse words. When I interviewed her in her North Tulsa home, she sang me one of the songs her grandfather taught her, also in Creek. Jake Simons was Cow Tom's grandson. He, like other black slaves owned by Native Americans, dodged the hijack, made his way west on the Trail of Tears, the forced relocation of Native American peoples from Florida to Oklahoma. Some of Cow Tom's descendants dispute he was ever a slave. I told you. Now, I know all the hijacks and the static and all those Pan-Africans. Oh, you can't prove he was you're just saying things. It says he was a slave and he was owned by No. Some of Cow Tom's descendants dispute he was ever a slave. Again, let's go back. Tustenugi Imafla, a Creek warrior, was a full-blooded Creek. Full-blooded, both parents. They aren't slaves. He was a full-blooded Creek, just like Johnny Mae Austin's ancestor. All right. Some documents say he was initially a Creek slave. Either way, he arrived in Oklahoma in the early 1830s and soon became a pillar of the Black Creek community and a man of considerable economic and political stature. Accounts from Cowtom's grandchildren describe him as a jet black man of medium build, whose success was measured by his seemingly unlimited supply of cattle. A cultural broker helped by his English skills and familiarity with white American culture, Cowtom eventually served as the principal chief of the Canadian town, a freed black township within the Creek Nation freed, and also represented the Creek Nation before the Interior Department. Cowtom's success was not particularly unique among hardworking black Creeks in eastern Oklahoma. On 18 November 1910, the Topeka Plain Dealer reported that a large percentage of the Negro population on the eastern side of the state had rich allotments from their Indian citizenship. So you hear this, right? Rich allotments from their Indian citizenship. How did these slaves get land? Well, now you know they were Indians. According to the same article, many of them started out as slaves of the Creeks, but gained freedom through the Emancipation Proclamation. The U.S. government compelled Native Americans to sign treaties allowing their former Negro slaves to share in their landed inheritance, meaning black former slaves were given plots of land in the Creek community. That was their land originally. And again, their family, his descendants, they dispute he was ever a slave. So listen to the family. Don't listen to what these documents are telling you, because that's a white man version of what they call you. They call you African. Remember in the last video, they called you African so they can enslave you. If they called you Indian, you'd be free. All right. Continuing, says, in Oklahoma in the late 1970s, Austin routinely received mail from the Creek Nation. The mail typically included news, ballots for voting on tribal matters, and checks or shares of the revenue from land and cattle dealing. That mail was a connection to an identity Austin always thought was true. It's just who I was, she says, until the mail suddenly stopped in 1979. This was the result of a 1976 federal lawsuit during which the Creeks had managed to shake off some of the paternalistic reach of the U.S. government. Creeks then voted to reconstitute citizenship parameters, kicking out many black people who had enjoyed citizenship since 1866. According to Daniel Littlefield of the Sequoia Nation Research Center, there's a strong element of "we are a tribe, Indians" to that decision. So I think it was probably just out and out racism that motivated those people to remove black people from inclusion in the nation. Citizenship parameters were now limited to those who could find ancestors registered on the 1906 Dawes Roll, a specific federal census that defined Native Americans according to the vague principle of blood quantum. Without the intricate genealogical testing that is readily accessible now, the Dawes Roll, based on interviews and eyeballing of people's ancestry, yielded less than precise results. Austin recalls a family story about her grandparents. One, who looked very dark, was assumed not to have Creek ancestry, and another, whose skin tone was very light, was assumed to be a Creek, but both were equally Creek. Alright, so you see that same family. Alright, one was dark, he was again considered a slave, African, not indigenous. His family, who's a little lighter, yeah, he was Indian. Now we've been reading the article, right? Making Indians white, because now we know that these were not based on color, but based on status. White meant status, black status, social status. All right, let's get this to our heads. They were playing games when they were doing all these classifications. All right, today, if you want a Creek citizenship, you would have to find a direct lineage to a person on that roll. Nathan Wilson of the Creek Citizenship Office says, Austin can't trace her direct lineage to the Creek by blood list of that roll, which the Citizenship Office uses for validating citizenship. But her family can be found on the Creek Freedmen list of the Dawes Roll. Coincidentally, their own and their ancestors' blackness nullified their Creek by blood status. You're hearing this, right? Instead, their case rests on an 1866 treaty between the U.S. government and the Creek Nation, which makes plain the nation's thoughts on citizenship. There are among the Creeks many persons of African descent. Dodge the hijack. The treaty notes So that's the treaty from 1866 when they're already pushing the hijack, right? Of you making you an African, a slave, and all that. And lists Cow Tom as an official delegate of the Creeks. And this is Sharon Lancey Scott, Secretary of the Creek Freedmen Band in Oklahoma City. The treaty states that persons lawfully residing in said Creek country, or even those who temporarily left as well as their descendants, may return within 1 year from the ratification of this treaty, as can their descendants and such others of the same race as may be permitted by the laws of the said nation to settle within the limits of the jurisdiction of the Creek nation as citizens. All descendants, the treaty adds, shall have and enjoy all the rights and privileges of native citizens, and the laws of the said nation shall be equally binding upon and give equal protection to all such persons and all others of whatsoever race or color who may be adopted as citizens or members of said tribe. Solomon Simon says the Creek Nation is not a race, it's a political entity, and they've got obligations. His main claim is that that treaty is still good law and hasn't been abrogated. He anticipated the Creek Nation's arguments. They're going to say they have a right to determine who are citizens. Technically, he agreed. I believe that it is your right to determine citizenship like any other sovereign nation, but just like any other sovereign nation, not a race, you, the Creeks, signed a treaty. This isn't Solomon Simon's first legal battle with the Creek Nation. In the early 2000s, he tried 2 cases somewhat similar to the one he filed this summer, but back then he did so within the Creek Nation's judicial system, with 2 other descendants of Black Creeks, Ron Graham and Fred Johnson, as his clients. After several bouts in the Creek Nation judicial system, Solomon Simons lost the case. The setback hasn't stopped him. As he pushes forward with his case, he follows in the footsteps of 2 earlier activists, Rhonda Grayson and Sharon Lancey. Both are relatively unassuming women and trailblazing activists for citizenship rights of Black Creeks. Grayson, a financial manager of delivery and repair service, grew up partly on the country roads of HAWAH, Oklahoma, where her great-grandmother, America Cohee, lived. Cohee only spoke the Creek language, and she only attended the Indian church. Grayson told me as she stared at the picture, rubbing her hands along the glossy laminated frame, she was 90 when we were kicked out of the nation. As a young person, Grayson didn't know about her family's expulsion from the nation. It was only when she talked with her grandmother that she decided to start doing my own research in the early 2000s by just going to the Oklahoma History Center. She wondered why my mother and my aunts, no one was enrolled in the tribe until someone at the History Center told me that my family were on Creek freedmen rolls. Lancey, a retired hospital manager, recalled her mother telling her of their ancestor Legus Chateau Perryman, a Black man who served as a principal chief of the Creek Nation from 1887 to 1895. And this is him right here, as you can see, right? She didn't realize she was a Black Creek member until 1979 because the distinction did not have much meaning before then. For Lancey and her mother, she was Creek first. When her official Creek mail stopped coming, my mother called the Creek Nation and they told her and my grandmother that they were freedmen and weren't entitled to any more checks, Lancey said. Lancey showed me a 1980 letter from the Department of the Interior's Bureau of Indian Affairs, which only affirmed what the nation told her mother. Despite numerous denied citizenship applications, Lancey holds fast to something her mother told her. Don't forget your heritage. All right, I'm going to stop right here, and I want everybody to pay attention to. All right, this is what Lancey's mom told her, right? A Creek Indian, an American Native woman. She knew who she was, and she made sure her daughter, right? She told her, don't forget your heritage, and don't let anyone tell you anything different. All right? So remember, Drop Nation, Mashahab to King Drop. If they can't tell you who you are, how can they tell you who you're not? All right? She and Grayson joined forces with other Creek descendants in 2012 to file for recognition, host national conferences, and create a documentary currently in development on the history of Creek freedmen. Now, as named plaintiffs in Solomon Simon's lawsuit, their motivation is clear. They want visibility. We are left out of Oklahoma history, Grayson says. It is a missing piece of history, and it's a valuable piece of history. Oklahoma history can't be history without the Creek freedmen. According to Alina Roberts of the University of Pittsburgh, Native American nations have always had this fear, and a valid fear, that when they accept black people as part of their tribe, they are seen as not Indian first. So this is a valid fear. I mean, if they're not the original Indians, why should they fear that? All right. Robert explains that Indianness is self-imposed as well as imposed from the outside. These nations have their own sense of who they are based on their culture and traditions they have retained, but also by the way they are legally recognized either by the state or federal government. This legal recognition, which often meant that unfair takeover of settled land, represents an imposition from outsiders, white outsiders, as to how much culture they're retaining. In fact, in the minutes of a 1977 quarterly Creek National Council meeting, the then Principal Chief Claude Cox expresses concern with the former 1866 Treaty and Associated Constitution of 1867. When you go back to the old Constitution, you are licked before you start because it doesn't talk about Indians. It talks about citizens, he told the council, referring explicitly to black districts within the Creek community. He described his fear of being outnumbered. You hear that? If we want to keep the Indian in control, we've got to take a good look at this thing and get us a constitution that will keep the Creek Indian in control, he says. But this isn't just about identity. As identity parameters could dictate sharing in financial gains, Robert says the actual disenfranchisement of black people by the Creeks and the Cherokee started in the late 20th century, coincided with a time when a lot of the tribes had begun to build their economies and make a lot of money. She points out this was precisely the time when many of the nations started to see an influx of enrollment applications. The current Creek Principal Chief Jamie Floyd declined to comment, and his press officers referred me to the nation's citizenship office led by Nathan Wilson. So he don't want to comment because he knows what's up. Don't want to comment. We're an independent agency constitutionally, and we're listed in the Constitution as independent, Wilson told me. But the vagueness of the nation's response shouldn't be read as a dismissal of the importance of the citizenship issue. In fact, the Creek Nation is lawyering up. Venable LLP, a top Washington, D.C. law firm, contacted Solomon Simons in August on behalf of the Creek Nation. Both the Creek Nation and the Interior Department have filed motions to dismiss on 5th October, and the court will respond on 2nd November. Creek leaders know that this won't be an easy fight. The Cherokee Nation and Seminole Nation lost in 2017 on similar grounds. For Solomon Simons, the case is clear-cut. His message to the Creek Nation is succinct. You have to follow the law like everybody else. Again, you have to follow the law like everybody else. And again, this was the article, The Black Americans Suing to Reclaim Their Native American Identity. Why do you have to fight so much to prove who you are? Why? All right, just wanted to show this as well. This is from John Hopkins. It says Sheridan Libraries and University Museums at John Hopkins University. And it says here, The Indians, #2, Son of the Red Man. All right, you see, I just wanted to show you. It says engraver, lithographer, artist, Thayers and Coast. So this is an engraving, and I wanted to show this because, I mean, first of all, let's zoom in a little bit. All right, so we got the Indians, right? As you can see, what are they showing you here? Remember, this is an engraving, right? So we already got, Dane Calloway showed us, examples of some engravings, and it's original pictures that exist based on those engravings. So this most likely is from an original picture or painting that somebody did. This is an engraving, a historical engraving, and there you see how they throw it in your face, right? The Indians. What does he look like? So here, look at the name of the song. It says, consistent of King Philip's Quickstep, son of the Red Man, Okahi waltz, Osceola quickstep, the Keokuk quickstep, the Black Hawk quickstep, the Mayo-Mick waltz. I don't know, they're making fun of this, but what happened is not funny. The history, the situation, you know, it's not funny, but as you can see how they, just put your image of your ancestor there and create songs about it and make dances about it. But yet they don't want to acknowledge you today, but they know who you were. They always did. All right. They know who you are. They've always known, right? So these are Wampanoags, right? Who did the Pilgrims encounter when they arrived? The Wampanoags, right? As you can see, who the Wampanoags were. So-called Negro, so-called Black, or so-called African American, Serbia Gold Mitchell, 1870s. All right, Telewima Melinda Mitchell. All right, this is in Massachusetts, and we already got, Martin Luther King's speech, right? And he told you before the Pilgrims landed here, you were already here. Your ancestors were already here. He was telling you, you were already here. All right, you were already here. Again, Serbia Gold Mitchell, 1891. Yeah. So in this article we've been reading, right? We've been reading about, this area of Virginia and what's going on in these times, right? So I just wanted to show you. So let's go right here. Chickahominy Indians. Let's take a look at this. I want to show you something. Chickahominy Indians posed in regalia at an unknown location sometime after 1920. They are probably in Richmond to present their annual tribute to the governor. The annual ceremony honored the terms of the treaty and in the Third Anglo-Powhatan War, 1644 to 1646. How long ago that was? In exchange for loyalty to the crown, the Chickahominy Indians received military protection from the English. The annual ceremony continues to be observed by the Pamunkey and Mattaponi tribes, but not the Chickahominy. All right, so this is the source says Palmer Gray Collection, Valentine Richmond History Center. All right, 1920. So let's see if we can get, there we go. All right, so I wanted to zoom into this image so you can see for yourself who is in this image. Look at this brother right here. I mean, look at almost all of them, basically all of them. All right, look at this. Chickahominy Indians. They know who you are. They've been playing you this whole time. You're the only one that doesn't know. You're the only one that doesn't know. All right. Oh, but Kurimeo, look at their hair. Man, you have a lot to learn. You have a lot to learn. Break the spell. Break the spell, Look at the brother right here. Yeah, these are Chickahominy Indians. All right. And we're talking about Virginia, and we've been reading this article, right? So you can get a perspective, correct orientation of what we're talking about when they're talking about Indians in Virginia. All right. Making Indians White, the Judicial Abolition of Native Slavery and Revolutionary Virginia and its Racial Legacy. This is part 4 of this article, White and Black Indians and the Erasure of the Triracial Past, Part A, Outward from Virginia. The effects of Virginia's debate over the legality of Indian slavery soon spread beyond the state's borders. This expansion was in part a direct effect. As Virginia exported many of its slaves throughout the South, it exported its thorny legal issues as well. In Vaughan and Phoebe, for instance, a Tennessee slave imported from Virginia claimed descent from an Indian. Ironically, a slave owned by Thomas Hardaway, the defendant in Robin, plaintiff's counsel argued that the evidentiary law of Virginia, which would have allowed the plaintiff to prove her Indian descent by hearsay, should control, or else a person as free as any of us would be transformed to a slave by the wonderful magic of crossing a state line. The court agreed with plaintiff's counsel. So they're saying if that applied to Hardin and Robin, then it should apply to this person as well. All right. The court agreed with plaintiff's counsel. It noted that as a matter of substantive Virginia law, all American Indians and their descendants are prima facie free, and held that Virginia's evidentiary law applied to the case before it. In short, as Virginia slaves diffused throughout the South, the racial and legal ideology that made Indians as free as any of us whites traveled with them. The legacy of Robin literally in this instance moved westward and southward as new areas opened to slavery. The influence of Virginia's freedom cases also stemmed from the legal debate they occasioned in other states over the legality of Indian slavery. In some places, including New Jersey and Louisiana, courts explicitly rejected the lawyers' claims that proof of being Indian is equivalent to proof of freedom. So they didn't accept that stuff. They were like, nah. Even though the court admired the Virginian doctrines on Indian slavery because they were liberal and honorable to the respectable judges by whom they have been delivered, yet elsewhere states either explicitly or implicitly followed Virginia's lead and declared Indian slavery illegal. In 1847, the Supreme Court of South Carolina overturned a case in which the trial judge had instructed the jury that there were only two races in the states, whites and blacks. Wow. And held that as a matter of law and human sentiment, Indian slavery could no longer exist. The opinion depicted the freeborn savage as a vanished people who once roamed independently through his own forest, holding the sparse remnants of the red man or copper-colored man in bondage would be cruel. As for the law, the court stressed the need for comity with our sister states, especially the ancient dominion of Virginia. This opinion underscores that the legacy of Robin persisted well into the 19th century and diffused throughout the courts of the antebellum United States, both directly through judicial precedent and indirectly through racial ideology. The legal problem of deciding where Indians fit in society, divided between blacks and whites, recurred outside the context of Indian slavery. A contemporaneous case from Ohio addressed the question of whether the descendants of Indians could vote in a state that limited the franchise to whites. Since the state's constitution established only three racial categories, whites, blacks, and mulattoes. We already know about mulattoes, dodge the hijack with all these tags. The court, after noting that Indian offspring served as clerks of court and were members of the bar in Ohio, determined that all nearer white than black. Listen to this. All nearer white than black, meaning if you were closer to being considered white, if your skin or your shade was a little lighter than black, or of the grade between the mulattoes and the whites, were entitled to enjoy every political and social privilege of the white citizen. You hear that, right? So if your hue, your skin color, your shade was a little lighter, then you were entitled to enjoy every political and social privilege of the white citizen. Okay? The Ohio Supreme Court thus faced the same problem that confronted the Virginian courts and resolved it in the same fashion. Although Indians were not whites, listen to this, please, very important part right here. Although Indians were not whites, social equals, their ambiguous existence in between whites and blacks impelled courts to legally classify them as whites to uphold the racial caste system. So Indians were being classified as whites, not because they were white or European, because it impelled courts to legally classify them that way to uphold the racial caste system. So if your brother, again, is a little bit light, he would be considered white. Left on the reservations, he gets to be, basically, he's entitled to every political and social privilege. If you, because you're darker than your brother, are considered black, you are a slave. All right? You're not free. You're not entitled to political and social privilege based on the hue or the shade of your skin. And this is the Pamunkey Indians on the same website. Yorktown Centennial says 1881. Says Pamunkey Indians posed for an unknown photographer at the Yorktown Centennial celebrating George Washington's victory at the Battle of Yorktown. Festivities were held from October 18th until October 21st, 1881. All right, I'm going to show you this. Now remember, this is 1881. We know the Spanish were in America since the 1500s. All right, so this is 300 years, over 300 years later. All right, so this is a close-up. I want you to take a look at what you see here. All right, so Pamunkey Indians on Virginia. All right, see some of the brothers right here. Again, remember America, the stronghold of the colored people. The colored people, copper-colored tribes of America. Part B. Robin's lasting legacy. Whiteness is so often asserted as a privilege in American society that it is easy to assume that the racial redefinition of Robin was a boon to Indians. But Indian whiteness was a limited and contingent right that did not imply racial equality with whites. It coexisted with the emerging conception among Anglo-Americans and natives that Indians were the red or copper-colored, right, members of a separate race. It also did not prevent centuries of race-based hostility that marginalized Indians as inferior. Indian whiteness, in parentheses, right, was defined primarily as a negative. Indians were not black. Even this limited grant of whiteness had pernicious long-term consequences for Indians. Although the ideology of Robin granted freedom to slaves who could prove native ancestry, it also suggested that Indians, unlike blacks, were close enough to whites to be assimilable. Anglo-Americans enacted this dogma by attempting to erase a distinct Indian identity. The primary agent in this policy was the federal government, which sought for most of American history to force Indians to conform to the conventions of white culture. The result for tribes were disastrous, eroding sovereignty and cultural identity. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, this attempt consisted largely of the civilization policy, a concerted effort to turn tribes away from their traditional economies and convert them into sedentary farmers. The 1887 Dawes Act forcibly imposed this goal on Indians living on reservations. We got a little bit of the Dawes Act right before, by parceling communal tribal land into individual farming plots and selling off the excess, with the aim of undermining tribal identity. This policy was reinforced by the common practice of forcing Indian children into boarding schools to kill the Indian. You hear this, right? Forcing Indian children into boarding schools to kill the Indian and save the man, they said. And by a series of Supreme Court cases affirming federal plenary power to regulate tribes' internal affairs, even in violation of treaties that granted tribal sovereignty. Although in the 1930s, the Indian New Deal's restoration of Indian self-determination rectified some of the damage these 19th century policies caused. After the Second World War, the federal government returned to a policy of acculturation known as termination, by which it sought largely unsuccessfully to end its relationship with tribes and encourage Indians to move to large cities in the hope that they would assimilate. Courts have recognized Indian rights to self-government and cultural autonomy only since the 1970s. You hear that? It is not so easy to escape history, however. The legal definition of Indian status remains a contested judicial and political issue, no longer because it confers freedom from slavery, but because enrollment in a federally recognized tribe determines jurisdiction and taxation, confers the right to health care and other federal services, and occasionally provides substantial revenue from tribal income. You hear all this? Why it's so controversial right now. Robin's legacy persists here too. By defining Indians as equivalent to whites, Robin implied that Indians could not simultaneously be black. So they couldn't be black. Not that you could be dark-skinned, but considered black a tag, a title, a slave. This separation of natives and Africans made the possession of multiple legal identities impossible, despite the existence of numerous intermixed groups of black Indians, in parentheses, black Indians, throughout the United States. Two present-day legal struggles, one in Virginia, the other in Oklahoma, underscore the significant implications which doctrine has had for modern determination of Indianness. It says here, Part 1, the Virginia tribes and the ongoing struggle for federal recognition. Although Virginia elites assumed after Robin that natives had disappeared from their society, Indians hid in the plain sight, subsumed into the free black population of the state. Indians hid in plain sight. You are there in plain sight. You've been there. Subsumed into the free black population. Free black, that was always you. Free colored, we already know this. Despite significant intermixing, the law maintained a strict division between Indians and blacks. Only natives with less than 1/4 African blood were considered Indians. The one drop, right? While the rest were labeled colored. Colored. All right. So they were just, okay, he is not Indian, colored. They'd go. So they were doing meeny, miny. So they were doing meeny, miny, mo. He's colored, he's Indian. He's colored, he's Indian. He's colored, Indian. Indian, colored, Indian. Yeah, they were just throwing words out there and classifying. The descendants of Indians even possess court-issued certificates that testify to their native ancestry and protected them from the numerous legal restrictions imposed upon free blacks. So much changes when they label you something else, when your neighbor could be your cousin, your brother, and he's entitled to political, right, privileges, social privileges that you're not. The need for such documents suggests that Virginian Indians appeared physically indistinguishable from their African American neighbors in the eyes of whites. Again, the need, listen up, the need for such documents. Why do you need to prove? Why do you need to prove you're an Indian if Indians and Africans are supposed to look totally different? But the reality is that Indians to the white Virginians appeared physically indistinguishable from their African American neighbors because it's all you, it's the same person, it's the same family in the eyes of the whites. In the 1920s, eugenicists even concluded that the remnants of the Virginian tribes could not possibly be true Indians since they looked black. And who's the dude who started eugenics, the eugenics movement? I believe it was Charles Darwin's brother. These people had an agenda. We already heard the scientific dogma emerging, right? That was making Africans, if you were called African, right, then you were less human and you can be enslaved. Or basically you're dark-skinned. And that was all Darwinism, eugenics did the same. Again, eugenicists concluded that the remnants of the Virginian tribes could not possibly be true Indians since they looked black. They looked black. They aren't black. They looked crayon color. There's no such thing as a crayon color. You don't look black. You can't look black. They're saying that you were dark skinned. They're saying that you look like a Negro. That these Indians can't be true Indians because they look like Negroes. That's what they're saying. The response was a series of so-called racial integrity laws that, among other provisions, excluded anyone with more than 1/16 Indian blood from being white. An Indian identity was finally erased from Virginian records. Legally, all Virginians became either black or white. Either black or white. No more mulatto. Virginia had at last completed the long process of Robin began of dismantling Indians' ambiguous racial status. It had obliterated the state's triracial past from its laws. Although repealed, the Racial Integrity Act continued to have pernicious consequences for Virginia's Indians in the present. To achieve federal recognition, tribes must meet 7 separate criteria, the first of which is proof of continuous existence since 1900, with all mention of them absent from the state records after 1924. Virginia's tribes could not achieve recognition through the standard method of petitioning the Office of Acknowledgement within the Bureau of Indian Affairs. You hear this? What's going on? The games they play? The sole alternative is federal legislation, which offers its own challenges. Congress is often reluctant to interfere in a matter it believes best left out to the BIA, and the process of recognition often devolves into politicized struggles over Indian gaming and land rights. Six Virginian tribes have sought federal recognition through congressional legislation since 2000, but they have only recently made progress after they accepted provisions barring casinos. Still, recognition is not assured. A bill to grant federal recognition to the six tribes passed the House in both the 110th and 111th congressional sessions. The Senate Indian Affairs Committee approved a Senate version of the House bill in the first session, but the version failed to pass before the recent adjournment. Given the support of Virginia's congressional delegation, it seems likely that the Virginia tribes will at last achieve federal recognition, albeit only after great difficulty. Their situation, however, is not unique. Other tribes have faced similar hurdles to recognition because the states classified them as white or black. So even when you were given the privilege of political and social privileges because you were white, it's messing you up now because now you're not even Indian. Because you were classified as black or white rather than Indians. The Lumbee of North Carolina have petitioned repeatedly but unsuccessfully for federal recognition since 1870. The Shinnecock on Long Island, Shinnecock, right? We got this on part one. Who's from the Shinnecock tribe? Oh, dirty bastard, right? On Long Island, finally received federal recognition in 2010 after a long wait, in part because they appear African American to outsiders. Because they appear what? So what does that mean? When you say somebody appears, that means they're not. They just look like, right? They're not African Americans. They appear only. They look Negro. That's what they're saying. They are Negroes. They've been here. American Indians. In its insistence that Indians and blacks are separate peoples and its assurance of the triracial past, the doctrine of Robin continues to undermine the tribe's ability to achieve federal recognition. Number two, the Oklahoma tribes in the legal battle over tribal membership. They always known who you've been and what they did when they came. All right, and we have here New Netherland Institute exploring America's Dutch heritage. All right, I just wanted to show you here something. It says here, you see the image, Indians of New Netherland. All right, let's zoom into this. It says Indians of New Netherland, 1671. Artist unknown. It says artist unknown, but I believe this is from John Ogilvy's drawings from his book. All right, look at this. What do you see here? Do you remember who you are? They have the records, they have the history. They're playing dumb. These are secret societies. They are lying to you in your face. They know who you are. You're the only one that doesn't know. Wake up. Look at this. Look at his hair, complexion. Look how they're dressed. Look how they're dressed. All right. Again, don't let them play dumb. They've always known who you are. All right? Always known who you are. All right, so let's take a look at this image right here. All right, it says America. All right, what do you see here? All right, so let's get a little bit of the information of this image. I just want to show you guys. It says here, allegorical figure of America. So dodge the hijack, allegorical, right? It's always allegorical, but they always keep putting so-called Negro as America. Why do they keep doing that if it's, Don't believe them when they talk about allegorical, because at the time they drew these, they weren't being allegorical. Native American woman seated on an alligator holding a cornucopia. The cornucopia, cornucopia of plenty, right? Just like in Assyria, in Egypt and all that, in ancient Greece and Rome and all that, that's where they get the name for corn, because that's where they had the grains for the maize, the cornucopia. All right, you saw my corn videos. And a parrot and attended by 4 figures representing different natives. All right, so 4 figures. All right, so 4 figures, right? 1, 2, these 2 right here. You see the different complexions? Your hair, all right? And then these other 2, you see their different complexions, right? You see the hair. All right, you see some more over here. And you see the Spaniards coming out of their ships, right? Bringing Christianity with them, you know. Y Jesus or death, that's what they told your ancestors. All right, but see how you were living. But you see when they came, how you were living, right? Cornucopia, the plenty, you had so much foods. You had fertile soil, you had greenery everywhere, rivers, clean water, gold in the rivers. Look at the gold they're giving them. You see that? Look how you were living. You see her? This is not allegorical. This is what they encountered when they got here. All right? In the background, European soldiers arrive from a ship and erect a cross and are greeted by Native Americans with golden vessels. Cultural artifacts include war clubs, feather headdresses and garments, ornaments, bows, spear, bird, headdresses, and dwellings. Also include a wool spear, shells, sacks of gold. Says here notes, the image of Europeans being greeted by Native Americans is taken from Theodore de Bray's depiction of Christopher Columbus' landfall in the New World. This print is one of 4 allegorical prints, each representing Asia, Europe, America, or Africa. Time period 1701, 1750. All right, John Carter Brown, University Collections. Do you remember who you are? They've always known who you are. That's why they played those games with the classification, and that's why they had to do that, so they can take your land so you wouldn't fight back for it. If you think you're from a foreign place, why would you fight for this land? All right, wake up. Making Indians White, Part 4, Section 2. The Oklahoma tribes and the legal battles over tribal membership. Tribes have also wrestled with historical legacy of Indian whiteness and controversies over membership. Federally recognized tribes have the power to establish their own criteria for tribal membership. In 1975, the Cherokee Nation enacted a provision restricting membership to descendants of individuals labeled as Cherokee on the Dawes Commission rolls, which were compiled in the 1890s to allot land under the Dawes Act. While such descent provisions are common among Indian tribes, in the Cherokee instance, this restriction had significant racial consequences. When federal officials compiled the Dawes Roll, they subscribed to the notion that Indians could not be black and vice versa. You hear this? So when they did this Dawes Roll, they already came in with a hijacked mind, a presumption that Indians could not be black or people of dark skin, not black, right? And vice versa. They therefore divided the Cherokee into those whom they considered actually Indian, labeling them as Cherokee, and those they perceived as black, whom they labeled freedmen. Many of the freedmen had been slaves of the Cherokee and possessed significant amounts of Cherokee blood, but they were regarded as ineligible for Cherokee identity because of their racial identity. It's not that they had significant amounts of Cherokee, it's that they were so-called Cherokee, because that's not even the tribal names that were in that. That Cherokee just meant that whole area right there. All right. By limiting tribal membership to those labeled Cherokee on these documents, the Cherokee Nation excluded most descendants of Cherokee slaves, as well as many others who seemed to the 1890s classifiers to be more black than Indian. The question of Cherokee identity had become an ongoing legal battle. In 2006, the Cherokee Supreme Court overturned the restriction on membership and required the admission of the freedmen. Less than a year later, a popular referendum amended the nation's constitution to reinstate the restrictive membership language. The Cherokee District Court, however, recently struck down that amendment. At the same time, the dispute had proceeded in federal court, where the plaintiffs had alleged that the restrictive membership requirements violate an 1866 treaty between the United States and the Cherokee, which guaranteed freedmen tribal membership. The latest ruling by D.C. Circuit in 2008 addressed questions of tribal sovereignty and allowed the suit to continue, but the final outcome remains uncertain. Other tribes, notably the Seminole, have included similar restrictions that exclude black members, so-called black, or people that are dark-skinned, which have also resulted in litigation. Such conflicts are the product of history in a double sense. Most obviously, they stem from the Dawes assumption, grounded in the racial ideology of Hudgens, that Indians and Africans are distinct races with different essences. So this is just a notion, an ideology. It's not true. And it's not Africans, remember, talking about Negroes, people of dark skin. But the restrictions also suggest the adoption of a version of this ideology by natives themselves. Although proponents of the membership restrictions have insisted that they seek only to preserve tribal rights to self-government, there is significant evidence that racial animus was at least a partial motive for the restrictions. Such hostility should be viewed in its historical context. From Robin onward, what few privileges natives could secure, freedom from slavery, ability to vote, or the right of self-government, came by distancing themselves from African Americans in Anglo-American conceptions. Modern tribes' insistence on their separateness is understandable given this history. Once employed by Virginia's courts to claim that Indian freedom did not threaten African slavery, native whiteness now excludes Afro-Native descendants from the present-day privileges of Indian identity. You see the games they played and the system they set up, right? So you basically end up in two dead ends because they created all these classifications and all these tags, right? And these legal terms, right? Now, number 3, part 4 of this article, Indians' equal protection and the black-white paradigm. The role of race in Indian law remains ambiguous. The Supreme Court determined in 1974 that legal classification of a person as an Indian is a political, not a racial classification, based on tribal affiliation and the historic trust relationship between the United States and tribes. You hear that? After this determination, Equal Protection Clause challenges to statutes granting special privileges to tribal members were dismissed. Such decisions protect tribes since the strict scrutiny applied to racial classifications would prove fatal to the numerous rights and privileges that rest entirely on an individual's Indian status. And Indian status continues to possess a racial component, however. Some tribes continue to use blood quantum to define membership, the same technique that Virginia lawmakers used in the 18th century to determine who was white, black, and mulatto. And we already know, how DNA works and all that, right? Federal common law and statutory definitions of who is an Indian often rely on ancestry or blood, as well as tribal membership. This ambiguity between political and racial identity perpetuates the confusion over Indian status, long present in American history. Many scholars of Indian law have argued for the elimination of the racial component of Indian identity. They argue that jurisprudence of race law developed in the context of the black-white binary does not apply to the unique historical and legal position of American Indians. They have also suggested that founders' understanding of natives enshrined in the Constitution was as separate sovereigns outside the American polity with whom the federal government had political relationship. The history presented in this comment both affirms and contextualizes these claims, as Robin and his progeny demonstrate the black-white paradigm that has long dominated American understanding of race applies poorly to natives, precisely because its creation rested on the implicit erasure of an earlier triracial history. It could exist only when Indians had disappeared from Anglo-American society. Disappeared in parentheses, you are still here. This amnesia also allowed the founders to understand Indians primarily as sovereign tribes outside the government of the United States, since in their minds Indians behind the frontier had largely vanished. Those who still claimed Indian identity within Euro-American settlements were either ignored or regarded, as Jefferson's descriptions of the Virginia tribes illustrate, as something less than real Indians because they no longer looked or acted as Indians should. So because you, my brother, are not wearing your feathers, you're not doing your tribal culture and traditions that you used to do, right? that you don't seem you're something less than real Indians because you no longer looked or acted as an Indian should. Because you don't dress the same, you don't act like how you used to act. Continuing, modern scholars reject the trope of the disappearing Indian, but they have embraced this version of the history of Indians as quasi-outsiders because it serves important political and legal ends. Emphasizing native separateness from the political and legal institutions of the United States provides a valuable counter-narrative toward ongoing efforts to reduce tribal sovereignty and self-governance. Yet there are costs to following the path of Robin, ignoring the triracial past in which the descendants of American Indians, often oppressed, marginalized, or enslaved, did live within Anglo-American society. Assuming natives outsider status plays into long-standing views of Indians as peoples of the past who are still not truly part of American society. Most American Indians no longer live on reservations. Again, most American Indians no longer live on reservations. They are called ghettos today, projects, right? But the fixed sense that natives have always lived apart means that for most 21st century Americans, as for the jurists of 18th century Virginia, the Indians who live among them are invisible. Again, the Indians, you, so-called Negro, that live among these people of the 18th century Virginia, right, were invisible. You weren't considered an Indian anymore. You were black or white. Depicting the status of American Indians as sui generis also blinds us to the broader commonalities between natives and other minorities. Placed in perspective, the complex history of Indians and their racial status before the law presented here is actually quite typical. After all, natives were not the only group in a legally nebulous area between black and white. Hispanics, Asians, and even Irish, Italian, and Jewish immigrants have had similar experiences. These are all tags, by the way. These parallels reinforce a point legal scholars have increasingly emphasized: the diverse nature of American society and the obsolescence of the black-white legal paradigm. The history presented here shows that the legal division of society into black and white has always been artificial. Again, the history presented here, what I'm showing you right now in this article, in this video right now, I'm telling you right now, the article's telling you, the scholarly professor from a university, right? It's telling you that the history presented here shows that the legal division of society into black and white has always been artificial. It doesn't exist. It's an illusion. It's made up. Courts and legislatures manufactured this separation and imposed it on a much more complicated racial reality. And you still going by that. You still believe in people. You still calling yourself black. You still calling yourself African or white. You think you're white because you're light skinned. And you think you're better than your dark skinned brother. The recognition that Indians played as fundamental a role in the construction of early American racial ideology as Africans did helps us to recognize that modern American diversity and its legal challenges is actually one of the country's oldest historical legacies. The lessons of this history are complex and do not lend themselves readily to policy pronouncements for the future. But these examples of the present-day impact of Robin do suggest several conclusions. The first is the lasting damage done by the racial ideology that insists that a person has but a single racial identity. The Indians cannot also be black, for instance. That is the hijack. That is the indoctrination they've put in us. All right? That's just an example she's showing you. She's telling you. In 2000, the US Census allowed participants to check off more than one box for race for the first time. But officials continue to assign respondents to a single race. As the Virginia and Oklahoma litigation suggests, such classifications can have a long and pernicious afterlife. The law should reflect the ways people self-identify more closely and prevent official but ill-informed categorizations from hardening into firm, judicially enforced boundaries. The second conclusion concerns judicial application of the Equal Protection Clause. The vast literature on this constitutional provision and its application to issues of race and discrimination is beyond the scope of this comment. So there's so much info that exists, she's telling you. To prove this, to what she's stating, there's so much info out there for you to research. But it is worth considering one implication of the long history presented here. One key criterion courts have applied in determining whether law employs a suspect classification is whether the class has faced a history of discrimination, the paradigmatic instance being African Americans' experiences with slavery and segregation. This perspective suggests that the more easily a group's past can be analogized to that of blacks, the more deserving that group is of protection. But the experience of Indians suggests that being declared white and being subjected to forced assimilation could constitute just as profound an experience of discrimination. So, you see, I just wanted to show you this article because you were not only being labeled black, but also white because you were a little bit light-skinned. And that didn't help you out either. Many minorities in American history, most notably, given recent legal struggles, gay men and women, dodge the hijack here, have faced profound persecution that pressured them not to separate from mainstream society, but to conform to it. You know, all respect to whatever you want to do, but I don't think this counts as the same. A struggle, whether you want to go, you know, do something unnatural, right? That's on your choice. But that has nothing to do with the struggles of so-called Indians and so-called blacks in America. Please do not compare that to that. Now let's get to the conclusion of this article. And thank you for being here. Conclusion. None of the participants in Robin versus Hardaway knew they were transforming the legal ideology of race in 18th century Virginia. The plaintiffs saw only a potential avenue towards freedom. The judges saw only an intricate legal question that required careful statutory interpretation. Only when set against the larger context of what came before and after does it become clear that Robin marked an important transition. It would be too much to claim that Robin alone caused the shift from a legally triracial to a biracial society. The course of history was never that straightforward. Freedom came to enslaved descendants of natives only after the revolution spread an emancipatory ideology. A demographic shift triggered the reevaluation of whites, conceptions of Indians, and the enslaved plaintiffs' own persistence forced Virginia's legal elite repeatedly to confront the issue. So only because they were like being hypocrites, right? They were fighting for their freedom against Britain, but then they were enslaving Indians. So they had to go with that because they couldn't be hypocrites to what they were pushing with the whole revolution thing, right? Yet once Virginia had judicially abolished Indian slavery, its precedent spread quickly to other states. Virginia's actions were thus emblematic of a moment of larger racial transition, one that cast Indians as simultaneously assimilable and banishing and African Americans as inherently inferior. So they killed your title or your identity as an Indian, right? It vanished, supposedly, and then you became African American, which was inherently inferior. You still call yourself that. Neither of these racial definitions proved advantages for these groups. Neither. African Americans faced years of enslavement and segregation, but Indians, selectively granted the privileges of whiteness, endured insistent and violent efforts to recast them as Anglo-Americans and redescription as fake or black Indians when they failed to comply. You hear that? So, oh man, so again, the 21st century United States is very different from 18th century Virginia, but it retains traces of Robin's legacy. By separating Indians from blacks, we still doing things that we did in the 18th century. By separating Indians from blacks, a stubbornly persistent racial ideology still confounds tribal efforts to achieve federal recognition and mixed race struggles to achieve tribal membership. It has also helped to reify the legal separation between black and white and to obliterate a more complex colonial past. One of the most striking parallels between then and now, though, is indirect. This comment has argued that law and society are interwoven. The abolition of Indian slavery was impossible without the broad shift in white Virginians' racial ideals. Moreover, the judicial change chronicled here did not come simply from the top down. Virginia's highest judges decided that the law should change, but it was the slave who forced the judges' hands by insisting upon their legal rights and continually bringing freedom suits before the courts. It's because you fought for yourself. Are you still doing that right now? In this historical case, at least it was the lowliest members of society who helped create and define judicial doctrine. 21st century Americans are participating in similar moment of racial reconfiguration. Again, right now, 21st century Americans, you so-called Negro, you're participating in a similar moment of racial reconfiguration because they've been calling you black, Negro, colored, African all these years when you were an American, Indian, Aboriginal, indigenous to this land who came out of the first, one of the oldest lands out of the primordial waters, as Agassiz, a renowned geologist, has told us. For the past 60 years, society and the courts have sought to undo the prejudices of 3.5 centuries, even as American society has become more diverse than ever. Race and racial prejudice have not vanished from America or from our legal system, but Robin's example suggests that persistent struggle by those on the margins can and did affect dramatic change. So what is she telling you? She's subliminally telling us that it's up to us to make the change, up to us to make the change. All right, again, this was the article, Making Indians White, the Judicial Abolition of Native Slavery in Revolutionary Virginia and Its Racial Legacy. It says Gregory Ablasky. JD candidate, 2001, PhD candidate, 2014 in American Legal History, University of Pennsylvania. All right, so dodge the hijack when people throwing the word pseudo at you. Do some research on your own. And I encourage you to go ahead and read this on your own. Find it. I was able to find it. I'm going to share the link in the description. Go through the footnotes. Verify all the information this person did, Gregory. So you can see it's verifiable history. It's not pseudo. It's law. It's history. And it happened. And that's why you are called African American today, or you were considered white. They've always known you've been here. They knew from the beginning. You know, they've been playing their games, you know, for hundreds of years, little by little, you know, removing you, taking your identity, taking your land until you're a foreigner, until today, now you're an African American. But they always knew. You just got to go dig into the history. Too many depictions all over the place, and these are not allegorical. You can go to certain maps and it's not going to say allegorical. It's going to say Native Americans, portrait of American natives or Native Americans, right? And you'll see what they're drawing like this. All right,